Hello, I'm Ron Roel, the host of 45 Forward. Now, March is the time every year when we celebrate Women's History Month, and today I'm going to bring you a great story of a woman you probably never heard of. And frankly, neither did I, until her son, Robert Norris, sent me an email from the Japanese island of Kyushu, where he has been living as an American expat for the past 40 years, learning how to grow, adapt, and age well across two different cultures. Robert is a distinguished writer and professor, now retired, who has written several novels and two memoirs, one of which I will tell you about today, called The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise. It's unique, and I have to say it's a thoroughly enjoyable story about his mother, Kay, who grew up in a large family during the Depression, moved halfway across the country to lead a long and unpredictable life, as she put it, as a dreamer and a rebel. She was a mom, of course, and an unwavering supporter of her son, but also at varying times she became a private pilot, a legal secretary, an adventurous traveler. From the get-go, she was an independent American woman, a fighter and survivor. It's a remarkable story of a remarkable woman told by a remarkable storyteller, her son, Robert W. Norris. So now let's meet my guest, Robert Norris. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ron. It's good to be here, and thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate it.
Let's just dive in. This isn't a biography and an autobiography in many respects, but
Right.
let's just start by giving the story of this remarkable woman, your mom, Kay, a little bit about her, her initial life. About it's in some ways it's sort of a classical American story of pioneering family and the troubles they went through heading west. So, give us a little bit of a sense of your mom.
Well, yeah, when I was a boy growing up in Northern California in the Redwoods in the 1950s, I remember since we didn't have TV back then, one of the ways that we would spend evenings as a family was listening to my mom's stories of her childhood. And her family and her own experience was probably not so dissimilar from the Joad family and John Steinbeck's great story, The Grapes of Wrath, about the Oklahoma family and losing their farm during the Depression, and then, like so many others from Oklahoma and that part of the country, migrating westward looking for work in Southern California. In my mother's case, she was born and raised the first few years of her life, up to maybe 4 years old or so, in North Dakota. And they lost their farm, and so a similar situation. They banded all the family members together, maybe 8 or 10 members together, and a couple of beat up jalopies, and migrated from the Dakotas to Washington and Oregon on the Columbia River, where they finally settled in a small logging town by the name of White Salmon, Washington, where her grandfather, who was like the patriarch of the family, found work in a sawmill, and that's where she grew up. And so, yeah, they didn't have much money, and she was very strong, very independent, even as a young girl, somewhat of a tomboy, rebellious and athletic, and but always doing what she could to help her family. She took on a lot of part-time jobs as a teenager in her high school years to contribute some money to the family, and all the members of the family were working, and they would pool everything. And if they happened to find some work, picking fruit in the orchards there, uh, they would share whatever their bounty was with everyone. And she had some really funny stories about her and her brother fighting over a simple orange of who got half, and and how to split it. And but yeah, she worked as an usher in a theater. She worked, I think, maybe in a hardware store or something. And then, of course, seasonal work picking fruit. And then just they had a little farm with some chickens and whatnot, so she helped around the farm. And so yeah, it was a typical hardworking family, and they didn't have much, but what they had was one another. And so I think that really had a great influence on her on the rest of her life. She was always a hardworking, independent person, and you know, just a wonderful woman.
Right. Yeah. I remember you were writing that they were in your conversations with there. There were tough times, but they were fun times, and I think
Yeah,
that because you had each other, and I think that I think there was a certain resilience that people had to have in those days.
yeah. What do they call it? The greatest generation. The generation our folks who went through not only the depression but also World War II, and they had to do a lot of sacrificing and make do with very little, but patching their own clothes and growing their own food and scraping together whatever they could and just contribute to the family as a unit.
Yeah. I love the story about the eggs. Tell the egg story. I thought,
Yeah, that was one of the stories that actually my grandmother would tell, and she had a great sense of humor too. And of course, she and my mom, they would tell these stories over and over and over again, but each time they would embellish them with a different detail, or depending on her audience's reaction, with a punchline here or there that was missing the time before. But at any rate, uh, probably somewhere in Idaho or someplace, they'd been camping out on the side of the road, and they hadn't had any food for a couple of days, and they were kind of desperate and hoping, that they could find some work on some farm somewhere, and get enough to get some gas to, get ahead to the next town or the next job that they could find. And they were just wondering, where's our next meal going to come from? And then right about that time, this big truck came zooming down the road, and they had to go around a pretty sharp corner right where they were at, and he was going too fast, and this truck was carrying all kinds of eggs, and it tipped over on its side, and probably half of the eggs got broken on the road, but there were a lot of them that weren't broken, and so the whole family, there must have been 8 or 10 cousins and whatnot, brothers, sisters, and just making a mad dash to gather up as many eggs as they could possibly fill their pockets and bags with. And then for the next 2 weeks, the way my grandmother told it, they ate nothing but eggs, hard-boiled eggs and soft-boiled eggs and scrambled eggs and poached eggs and eggs every which way that you can think of it. And my mom got so sick of eating eggs that for the rest of her life she couldn't even look at an egg. And I don't remember eating eggs very much even as a kid years and years later. She just had a real aversion to eggs. It probably brought back too many memories of hunger pangs maybe. And it kind of reminds me of, did you ever see that movie with Paul Newman and Cool Hand Luke? And I can eat 50 eggs. Yeah, probably that was the feeling that she had.
yeah, yeah. And remember seeing the movie and just lying there afterwards, like prone, like oh my god, and he did it, but barely. He won the
Yeah,
bet. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So let me talk about the in light of all this stuff that your mom and family went through. The title itself, which is the good Lord willing and the creek don't rise. Talk about what that means for people who don't know. But I know, but because not my family so much, but my wife's family, was from a sort of hard working class family in Pennsylvania. My mother-in-law would say that sometimes. Tell
Oh.
people what that meant to you.
Well, I remember my mother used to say that all the time, and I think she got it from her mother, and probably who got it from her grandmother, going back, several generations. And uh, they were very optimistic people, despite the hardships that they went through. Maybe she was half Irish, so maybe that part of her personality came through. But and she had a little bit. Well, she was raised as a Catholic, but I think she had a little bit of the superstitious side to her too. And so she used to call herself a cockeyed optimist, and that she couldn't escape from her optimism. But I remember as a kid, whenever we would complain to her about something, or cry in our milk about all the woes that we had. I had this girl doesn't like me at school, or I struck out in the little league game, or I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. My life is all over and finished. But then she would always say, don't worry, dear. Don't worry, dear. Everything's going to be all right. Don't you worry. Just, keep your chin up, work hard, and everything will be all right. And then probably some little voice in the back of her head that would say, almost like knock on wood or something, but she would follow up that remark with, the good Lord willing and the creek don't rise. And I remember my grandmother using the same expression a lot. So, whenever troubles befell us, she always used that, and it had the effect on us kids of hey, maybe we'll be lucky. Maybe not this time, but next time, all things considered. And that seemed to me like it, it was kind of symbolic of her personality in a sense. And so when I was thinking about uh, what to do about the title for the book, I thought, that pretty much signals what her personality was all about. So I chose The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise.
Right. Yeah, I think as you mentioned, it's so there's a certain dogged optimism about life, but also kind of a recognition that there's some things you can't control. God willing, and if the creek rises, nothing you can do about that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
a storm, and so you have to hope that doesn't happen, but recognize it could happen. So there's a little bit of just letting go of things that you can't control and doing what you can, but that things will happen. So
yeah. And
you
I
know,
used to have this image in my
yeah,
head of, my mother thinking, well, maybe the next meal won't be eggs. The good Lord willing, and the creek don't rise.
right, and the truck don't tip over.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So let's talk about just a little bit about the book and how it came about, um, and why you decided to do it, and a little bit about the process of it, because I guess it was a compilation of many hours of you talking with your mom, having conversations and pulling out letters and so forth. Just tell us how you did the book.
Well, yeah. The original project, jumped way ahead from growing up in the Northern California redwoods to, retiring in Japan at the age of 65 or so. A lot of experiences in between, but in between, if I just talk about my mother and maybe just summarize very quickly what an incredible life she had and some of her accomplishments. She was very much an independent sort, and she wouldn't take any guff from anybody. She had a real, strong sense of justice and what comprised injustice. But I think the work ethic that she learned from growing up with her family and surviving as a unit really helped out in later years. She ended up marrying fairly young, and then that marriage didn't work out, and so she divorced maybe in her mid or late 30s, and she was more or less ostracized by this small logging community, and she also had some problems with the Catholic Church because she had been very faithful, and she was even the every Sunday was the organist for the church services and sermons, and she put in a lot of time for the church. And then when she divorced and then got remarried, she was basically excommunicated from the church. And so, a lot of small town gossip, how she used to say all the hens were clucking all day long, talking about her. And so she had to deal with that, and but she always she had a kind of stubborn pride as well. And so in those days, you know, job opportunities for women were fairly limited, and at any rate, she always worked part-time jobs, whether waitressing or at a florist's or whatever work she could pick up, just cleaning, cooking, whatever. At any rate, after she divorced and got remarried, in her 40s, I think she had always had this dream of becoming a pilot. Uh, I think when she was in her teens, there was like a barnstorming group that came, and you know, there weren't too many pilots back then, but she somehow was able to buy a ticket and get a ride with one of these barnstorming pilots, and she was so impressed by that that she just loved the experience of flying, that became a dream, and she realized that dream in her 40s when she used some of her money from working part-time jobs to pay for a kind of ground school. And there were no women doing that at the time, but she passed the ground school. She got her pilot's license, and she ended up working part-time as a fire spotter for the Forest Service in Lake Tahoe for a couple of summers. And she ended up going back to Kansas City, I think, or maybe it was Denver, I forget which, but with her flight instructor. And she flew a Cessna by herself all the way back to San Francisco. And she became like the head of the 99ers. I think it was this group of women pilots, that organization that had been founded by, I think, Amelia Earhart back in the 1930s, perhaps. And so she loved that, and that was a real sort of motivating force for her to study hard. And then at that time, she picked up a job as a clerk for the local judge in this town of Truckee, California, near Reno, Nevada. And she liked that work, and so she started going to night school again in her 50s to become a legal secretary. She got the qualification and certificate, and she started a career in her 50s, and she worked till she was about 78. And so, and then, in the meantime, I ended up in Japan, and she came here maybe 7 or 8 times visiting, and so she started studying Japanese, and she loved to well, she was really into the arts as well. She was very artistic in music and painting and poetry. And so when she died, I was about 70. In fact, she died very close to my 70th birthday. And I had all these, I had a whole lifetime of correspondence. She was a very prolific letter writer. And so I had decades worth of not only old letters but email as well, and a lot of her paintings that she sent me, and poetry. And then a couple of times when I went back to the States to visit, and she was living in Portland, Oregon at the time, and we would sit down in the evenings and I would record. I asked her to tell some of the old family stories that she used to tell, and she did, and I recorded those on audio. So I had maybe about 20 hours worth of stories. And so a few videos. One time when she came to Japan to visit, I was teaching at a university, and I had her as a guest professor for the day. And so we took a video of that, and I had a few other videos of her. So I had all kinds of source material, and I had always wanted to write my own memoir. A lot of my earlier fiction was very autobiographical, but after she died and going through all this material, I realized what an incredible story her life had been, and that I just wanted to preserve her spirit somehow. And so I gathered all this stuff. I transcribed all those audio tapes, and I started writing my own memoir, but the focus suddenly became her life. And so in the end, I combined the two into one story. And I was in my 70s, so there's no guarantee at this stage that, to write separate books. So I put them into one long 500-page book, and it was a life-changing experience. In a sense, I was able to go back and relive both our lives together, and what a joy that was. She was an incredible woman, had a very strong influence on me.
Yeah. Well, talking about that, I think that well, that is interesting. I mean, two things. One is that people do talk about, the sense of legacy, and when your parents get older, it's something that a lot of families think about. Like, wait a minute, what do we want to preserve? It's their thoughts, their memories, their aspirations, especially their stories. That because those are the things that matter to you and to the next generations
Right,
or
right.
people after you. So, I'm glad that you sort of got a hold of that, and also, it's a biography and autobiography, as you mentioned. So, there's a lot of influence on you, and I think about, I know it's mostly about your mom, but I know you were. Well, you grew up like I did. We're almost exactly the same age. So through the '60s and early '70s, we went through, kind of a rebellious era of student protests and so forth. And so you, you had which we'll get into in our second interview with you. With spoiler alert, we're going to divide your stories into two podcasts. But you traveled quite a bit too, and there was a lot of adventure and kind of like, well, let's see what happens now. And I got the sense that I guess this happened. You just laid out your mother's life over several decades, but early on in your life, it seems to me that got infused with some of your mother's
DNA
independence
maybe.
and yeah, and adventure. Like, okay, let's do this. Did you get that sense of that you picked this up, from your mom, whether you liked it or not?
Yeah, I picked up all the really positive things. I think this sort of optimistic attitude towards life. The old glass is half full type of feeling, and uh, yeah, the influence, her courage, in facing up to a lot of really difficult situations, and always doing it with great humor, uh, and always somehow ended up coming out of things smelling like a rose, and maybe there was something to that. But even as a kid, we had a very deep relationship in that we could talk about our feelings a lot. And she was a very fair person. I could sit down, and if I thought the rules that she was laying down for, what the boundaries for me as a kid, or my brother and sister as well, the limits on our behavior and whatnot. Sometimes we resisted, and I think that sort of rebelliousness I definitely inherited from her, because she would rebel against authority quite a bit, and uh, but we were able to sit down and talk things out, and if I could convince her of maybe the correctness or the righteousness of my own opinions, at least give her some detailed reasons on why I felt a certain way. And if it was convincing enough for her, she would compromise. And I learned. I think I learned a sense of righteousness from her and a sense of adventure from her. She was never afraid to try new things, and always encouraged us to read. She had a great love of literature, so I was introduced to a lot of great books early on, adventure stories, and she was interested in the outside world. And so in the '60s, when the Vietnam War came along, although my father, who was a World War II hero, he flew with the invasion of Normandy, and of course, I ended up, facing the draft at the age of 18. This was in 1969, and so at that time there were basically three choices we had. I think one was, accept your fate and go into the service, into the army or the Marines, and the odds were that we'd be would be sent to the front lines of Vietnam. And in those days, who knew where Vietnam really was? We'd never heard of that country until it started appearing on the news late at night. And even then, it seemed distant. It didn't seem real until somebody's brother would come home really changed and have severe problems adjusting to society again, or others, had their brothers die in Vietnam, and then and it was on the news every night. So yeah, naturally we started talking about it and becoming slightly more politically aware. Well, yeah, there was that one choice of being drafted. If you were against the war, there was the choice of maybe going to Canada, but the odds of being able to return to the States were against you. And so, what would your life be like there? Or you could go underground, or you could refuse to fight and probably go to prison and ruin the rest of your life. So, I ended up the one alternative as a very naive country bumpkin was to join the Air Force, either the Navy or the Air Force, and I went to see an Air Force recruiter, and he painted the most incredible pictures. Don't worry, you'll never have to carry a weapon. You'll never have to go to Vietnam. You love basketball? Hey, you can play basketball 24 hours a day. You'll probably get sent to Europe there. You'll meet all these beautiful women, and you'll have one adventure after another. And I said, where do I sign? Where do I sign? And, you know, the first day of basic training, I knew I'd made a mistake. And I ended up getting put in the only career field in the Air Force that was combat trained, and my job was to guard B-52 bombers. And so I got sent to a base near Sacramento. It was called Beale Air Force Base, Strategic Air Command Base, that had a lot of B-52 bombers. And every night walking around those, they looked like these big prehistoric birds of prey or something, that symbolic of all the destruction going on. Of course, I was reading things like the underground GI newspapers that were finding their way on base, and listening to Bob Dylan and Crosby, Stills and Nash and all the anti-war lyrics, and getting into discussions with returning soldiers. And so the option of applying for conscientious objector status became another thing to think about. And so I felt that I wouldn't qualify because I didn't have a really strong religious background. I'd quit going to church when I was about 12 years old. And so I found out that later that the Supreme Court had made a kind of precedent-setting decision in 1970, early in 1970, where they recognized not only religious upbringing as a means of conscientious objector status, but also more on philosophical grounds were recognized. If you could lay out in a convincing manner that you were truly against killing other human beings. Well, this was around the time Kent State happened in 1970, when Nixon bombed Cambodia after promising the nation that he was winding down the war, and actually expanded the war into Cambodia, and the whole nation erupted. Then, as you remember, demonstrations on hundreds of campuses, and then the National Guard was called in on Ohio at Kent State, and they ended up shooting 4 young kids and wounding 9 others. And then about a week later at Mississippi, Jackson State, a similar thing happened where 2 black students were killed. And at the time, we were actually in our few off hours as guards of B-52 bombers and security police, we were forced to undergo training to deal with any kind of uprising that might happen locally if demonstrators came to try and cause trouble at our base. And I wondered, could I actually point my M16 at another teenager when I didn't believe in the war myself? And so I knew right then and there that when my order came, and it was coming eventually, that I would have to refuse. And so my order did come shortly after Kent State, and I decided after much soul searching not to go. And so I returned to the base, and I was called into the commanding officer's office and given my final order with witnesses around. And of course, in the meantime, I had consulted with a lawyer, a military lawyer, who was kind of an anti-war guy himself. And so he counseled me not to say no, but just to repeat the sentence over and over that I don't feel I'm mentally or physically capable of killing another human being. And they were so anxious to make an example of me to the other airmen, the other soldiers, that they decided then and there to court-martial me. And at my court-martial, I was facing 5 years of prison and a dishonorable discharge, and the crime, the military crime, was willful disobedience to a direct lawful order. And I was found not guilty of that, but guilty of the lesser military crime of negligent disobedience to a direct lawful order. And the difference between the two was that I had not used the word no in refusing my order. I just repeated that sentence over and over. And so at that moment, and I was only 19 years old at the time, but that was when the importance, the power of language really struck home at that time. And so that's a long story. But as a result of that, after I served my time and returned to society, I was a bit, I don't know, I dove headfirst into the counterculture and all that implies. And so, I worked labor jobs here and there, but I just didn't feel so American anymore. And so, like many of us, the hippies of the day, I ended up going on a search for identity, and I hitched across the states and ended up in Europe, bummed around there for about 5 or 6 months. And everybody I met, all these young European hippies who were basically doing the same thing, they all spoke 3 or 4 languages, and they were all making music and expressing themselves in different ways, like painting and poetry and music and songwriting. And I was so, I don't know, influenced, impressed by them, especially that they could speak so many languages, and I could only speak my native language, and not very well at that. But when I finally returned to the States, I too wanted to express myself somehow, and that's when I began studying about literature, and I wanted to become a writer. And so I started off with short sprints of writing short stories and longer, and eventually, about 4 years later, I felt it was time to try a novel. I'd had some pretty unusual experiences by then. I wanted to write about them. So I returned to Paris at that time. And in Paris, I met an Afghan, this is 1977, an Afghan and an Iranian, and helped them out I'd picked up a little bit of French by them, and they were staying in the same cheap hotel that I was in, and they wanted to give some message to the desk clerk, who spoke only French, of course, to some German friend who was supposed to call for them. And somehow my crude French was understood by the clerk, and they were overjoyed with the help that I'd given them, and they, on the spot, invited me to come back to their countries with them. And this was when the Shah was still in power, so it was before the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, and a lot of American oil companies were there, and there were some expatriate Americans living there, and they convinced me that I could probably find some work teaching or something. And I thought, well, I've never been to that part of the world. That might be interesting. Plus, Paris was very expensive. My savings were running out real quickly, and so that was the start of a around the world journey, where I ended up on the old hippie trail through, was it, Yugoslavia, the old Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan. That was an amazing experience in Afghanistan, and Pakistan and India. And when I returned to the States, I had a serious case of cultural shock, reverse cultural shock, I think. And at any rate, all these experiences had sort of, I don't know, influenced me to the point where I wanted to live. My dream was to live and work and study in a foreign country. And somehow fate was kind to me. And about 4 years later, I ended up coming to Japan in 1983 in January, and I found a job teaching English in English conversation school, and that was the start of my life in Japan. It's 43 years later now.
And just returning full circle to your mom, and I mean, in two ways. One was your mom was always very supportive of your adventures, which
Right.
I thought was, it wasn't so easy in those days. Parents who loved us, but were like, well, why not? Okay, okay, enough of that. Go get a job, go to law school or business school, whatever, and settle down. And your mom was always, her own adventurous spirit, always supported you. And I think I recall you said that even you talked about her sense of fairness and justice, was very much a defender of your decision as a conscientious objector. And I guess there was a scene where she went in, she wanted to see you, right? And they refused to let her see you, and she did not react kindly to that. Just tell that quick story.
Yeah, I didn't find out about this until a few years after it happened, but apparently, right after my court martial, I had to spend about a month in this small jail, housed maybe about 6 or 8 prisoners at Beale Air Base, where I was stationed, where I was court-martialed. But the majority of my punishment, my prison time, was in Denver, Colorado, at a bigger prison for nonviolent criminals, so to speak. But at any rate, the first maybe 3 weeks after my court martial was spent in this small jail in Beale Air Base. And sometime during those 3 weeks, I don't know how she did it, but she stormed onto the base. She must have done a lot of really hard talking to the guards, but they somehow allowed her onto the base, and she made her way to my commanding officer's office and stormed into his office and demanded to see me, and he wouldn't allow her to see me, and she started insulting him and talking against the war and defending me in whatever way she was. But that Irish temper, she didn't display it very often, but I can imagine how she was you know unafraid of even the military at this point. Well, he called in some guards, and they actually physically removed her with her legs kicking in the air, and took her out to the entrance to the base and shoved her off the base with their M16 rifles pointed at her, and told her that if she would ever even attempt to come back onto the base, that legally they could shoot her. and, I thought, wow, that's a symbolic story of how strong a mother's love can be for her son, that she's willing to fight against the military and
Yeah,
maybe even lay down her life for her child.
yeah.
But yeah, her courage
Well, that is a
and
mother's love. Yeah,
yeah, but also there's a certain amount of
yeah.
foolhardiness to that as well, and I picked up some of that as well. It's fingers
Yeah,
crossed, that I never really had to suffer any worse punishment than that in my life. But yeah,
yeah, yeah. So, just returning to the title and sort of our concluding thoughts. So the subtitle is about pentimento. So it's sort of a pentimento journey, as you put it, and which I found very interesting. So just describe pentimento briefly. I know what it is because actually, interestingly, my mother was an artist, and one day, although I had been reading this as you had Lillian Hellman's book, Pentimento, my mom was telling me about this notion of when someone paints in the painting, sometimes they go through and there's something else underneath it that the artist was originally drawing and changed his or her mind and painted over it. But you can discover sort of a process of discovery about their thoughts. So I wanted to talk to you about the pentimento journey that you discovered in the process of doing this. And I want to just read, Robert, just a bit of a quote from your introduction, which I found kind of fascinating. So you wrote, "In the end, do our memories preserve the truth or do they hide it? Or is the truth always changing? Does all those things in the past really happen? Or are they merely dreams, figments of the imagination?" Pentimento becomes a metaphor for memory, an analogy to a particular difficulty of artistically remembering life, telling the truth despite the mendacity of memory. The feelings of these memories evoke are entirely real, telling of a decades-long conversation I have constantly in my head. The two of us sitting in Mom's dining room table, sipping cups of coffee and discussing our lives and experiences. So what did you discover in this pentimento process? Were there things that, in the retelling of the stories, that you discovered that, wow, I never thought about it that way, or that changed the way you thought about life?
Yeah, pretty deep question, actually. But but yes, in addition to "The Good Lord Willing" and "The Creek Don't Rise" as my title, uh, while I was going through all those letters and emails and CDs and tapes and paintings and pictures and all kinds of material to go through, and in a sense reliving both our lives and our relationship. Uh, and I should say that yeah, the subtitle itself was "Pentimento Memories of Mom and Me," and I had been a big Lillian Hellman fan, maybe in my 40s when I really discovered her, and I thought, wow, that is so apt, as a metaphor for memory. So the strange thing was that while going through all that stuff that I had, I found myself actually changing. Like my memories of my mother changed, and my memories of my own life changed. And I started thinking about her life and my own life and our relationship differently. In younger days, even in my 20s up until my 30s, our relationship was always mother and son. Like she was the almost like the authority figure, and like a confidant or somebody that I could talk to, and in ways that I couldn't talk with other people. I could share things about my worries or my dreams or whatever. And she was the same way, but sometime, maybe when I was around 30 years old or so, our relationship changed from mother son to best friends, I think. And so she started talking more and more about her own worries, about her own regrets, of some of the decisions that she'd made in her life. And one of her regrets was that she had probably married too young. She had also had a lot of dreams about getting out and seeing the world and becoming independent woman, not relying on her husband, for financial security, and being able to, in a sense, forge her own life. And so I learned a new kind of respect, of the sacrifice that she made, for us kids, basically. All those dreams she effectively threw away in order to raise a family. And then, she didn't have the best results in her marriages. She ended up divorcing twice, but she was strong enough in later years to forge that career. And finally, she would tell me sometimes that she was so happy that she could live out her dreams vicariously through my own adventures. And our correspondence, I would describe a lot of the places that I saw around the world, and the experiences that I had. And so one of our ways of connecting, when she was in her 60s and beyond, and she had visited Japan a few times in the meantime, was I became her Japanese teacher. And we would have these Skype calls, and I would give her homework, and she was just totally enthralled with the Japanese language. And And I think this gave her a kind of another vicarious way of traveling and using her imagination. And more than anything else, I think I learned to respect. I'd always taken her talents for granted because she was my mother. You know, she was the greatest mother in the world. But objectively, she was an incredibly talented artist, and she had a very deep artistic soul and this deep need to express herself. And when I stopped to think about it and hearing her stories again, but her love for music, and not only could she play like pop songs on piano, but she also could play like some classic tunes. And her father had a strong influence on her. He was, I think, a clarinet player, and he forced her to learn a lot of early music lessons, studying classical music, and she hated it, but she wanted to play pop music at the time. But she had the ability to play, and she could read music. She was very talented at painting. We still have some paintings of some of the mountains and nature around the Oregon and Washington country. And uh, after she came to Japan, she became very interested in this sumie ink painting, where it's sort of a minimalist approach, and you don't have a chance to paint over. There's no pentimento changing in uh, marking over an earlier draft. One stroke brush is there forever, and so you have to concentrate really hard and see it in your mind before you lay out any scene in nature, bamboo or birds or whatever. And she became obsessed with that and language, and she loved literature, and she used to write a lot of letters to the editor. She had some of her poems published in local newspapers, and so I learned to really respect uh, her artistic soul, and appreciate that maybe I was able to inherit a bit of that as well. And so it was a wonderful process, in a sense, reliving our lives, but seeing how it changed from sort of the immaturity of my early days, and then uh, being a sort of obsessed with my own life from, say, my 30s to my 50s, where I concentrated mainly on my career, and really didn't pay that much attention because we were separated by the Pacific Ocean. We couldn't really see each other physically that much, but uh, we communicated at least a couple of times a week via either letter, email, or video, online video. And so I felt really, uh, I don't know, blessed in a sense to have had her as my mother. And she lived a great life. She died at the age of about 90, a couple of days short of her 95th birthday. And she lived life well. It was a well-lived life, and you know, as much love as I had, I also had great respect for what she had done with her life.
People think about just sort of doing a memoir as just recording your past life, but I think it's what you've mentioned is important, that it's a dynamic process actually, and thinking about, well, how it shaped you, and you're still changing, and the pentimento of your seeing things you didn't see before, and because you don't get a chance to, a lot of times if you don't go through this process, you don't learn about this. I mean, you may record some of it from your letters or wherever, but you don't have that process that you had of actually talking to your mom and having conversations, and reliving the stories, and sort of rethinking who you are and who you were. So I'm glad that you got that process, and I'm thinking about your stories, and then what you inherited from your mother, and certainly a sense of independence, sense of justice and perseverance, and in your own way, mirroring your mom's life as a dreamer and a rebel in many ways. I mean, deciding to live in Japan. So yeah, so we're gonna stop here, and just I appreciate all your time, and I look forward to our next podcast when we're going to talk a lot about your life in Japan and your perceptions about living across cultures and what you learned, and about not only differences in the way we live, but also in the way we age, which of course is important for my podcast of 45 Forward. So before we conclude, Robert, just tell us, where can we find out more about your books? We'll talk next time too about the next book about All That We Are, which is a lot about more reflections about your life in Japan. But where can we find out more about your books and about you, and whether you have a blog or a website and so forth?
Well, probably the website is the best place to go to. It's at Robert W. Norris. That's one word, RobertWNorris, robertwnorris.com. And everything is there, links to the books, and they're available in ebook form, paperback, and all my academic writings are there, papers that I've produced while I was working in the university system in Japan, and it's all there. And email is also included there.
Right, right. Well, I once again thank you, and I obviously I haven't finished it, but I have read here about the creek not rising. So it's a terrific read. So I encourage people to go out and buy it. So thanks very much. Until the next time, Ron Roel from 45 Forward. Thanks very much, Robert Norris.
Thank you very much, Ron. I look forward to our next chat as well.